The courtroom was thick with the scent of polished wood and old law books, a place where the weight of justice hung in the air like an oppressive fog. Every inch of the room was designed to command respect. The towering judge's bench, the heavy oak tables, the rigid rows of pews where spectators sat in silent anticipation. Officer Daniel Carter had been here countless times before, his uniform always crisp, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights, and his presence a sharp reminder of authority. He carried himself with the arrogance of a man who had never once questioned his own power, a man who knew that, in a place like this, people like him always came out on top. That morning was no different. He walked in with the same measured confidence, his boots clicking against the tile floor as he exchanged nods with familiar faces. Other officers, attorneys, even the judge himself. He had no reason to expect anything unusual. After all, he had handled this kind of case before. A simple disorderly conduct charge against some black woman who thought she could mouth off to the wrong people, make a scene where she didn't belong. He barely glanced at the case file in his hands, his focus instead on scanning the room, making sure everyone knew he was there. And then he saw her. She stood near the defense table, her posture straight, hands clasped in front of her, the picture of quiet composure. Her skin was the color of rich mahogany, her hair neatly styled, her tailored navy suit exuding the kind of authority that didn't need to be announced. There was something about the way she held herself that struck him as unusual, an unshakable presence, a sense of control that most people didn't carry in a room full of cops and lawyers. Daniel narrowed his eyes. He had dealt with defiant black women before, the ones who thought they were above the law, the ones who didn't know their place. He stepped forward, shoulders squared, his grip tightening on the case file as he made his way toward her. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step back and take a seat," he said, his voice firm, the same voice he used when issuing commands he expected to be followed without question. She turned slowly, her gaze locking onto his with a cool, steady intensity that sent a flicker of irritation through him. "Excuse me?" she asked, her tone calm but edged with something he couldn't quite place. Daniel gestured toward the benches. "This area is for attorneys and court personnel. You can wait in the seating area until your name is called." There was a beat of silence, the kind that stretched just long enough to make him uncomfortable. He wasn't used to hesitation. People either obeyed or they argued. Either way, he was always the one in control. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," she said finally, but she didn't move. Daniel felt his patience thin. He didn't like it when people hesitated, when they acted like they had some kind of power in a situation where they clearly didn't. His hand hovered near his belt, a subtle reminder of the authority that weighed heavy on his hip. "I don't think there is," he said, stepping closer, his shadow falling over her. "I said you need to move." And then, in one swift motion, he reached out, his fingers closing around her arm, ready to yank her aside like he had done to countless others before her. But the moment his hand made contact, a ripple of energy seemed to pass through the room, a collective stillness, a breath held all at once. Her eyes never wavered. She didn't flinch, didn't recoil, didn't react the way he expected. Instead, she exhaled, slow and measured, and spoke with a quiet authority that cut through the tension like a blade. "Officer Carter," she said, his name rolling off her tongue like a carefully placed chess move. "I suggest you remove your hand. Immediately." It wasn't a plea. It wasn't fear. It was something else entirely. Something that sent a sharp, unfamiliar sensation crawling up his spine. Confusion. His grip loosened slightly, his mind scrambling to process the sudden shift in the dynamic. "And who exactly do you think you are?" he demanded, his voice carrying more venom than before. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached into the inner pocket of her suit jacket, moving slowly, deliberately, as if she were giving him time to understand what was about to happen. She pulled out a badge, a gleaming, unmistakable emblem of authority, one that outranked his own. "Chief Olivia Parker," she said, her voice like steel wrapped in velvet. "Your new boss." The words landed like a gunshot, silent but deafening. The room, which had already been teetering on the edge of shock, seemed to freeze entirely. A heavy, Sinking sensation settled in Daniel's stomach. Something cold, something ugly. He had made a mistake. A very, very big mistake. And by the way she was looking at him, steady, unshaken, completely in control, he knew that she wasn't going to let him forget it. For a brief moment, silence filled the courtroom, thick and suffocating, stretching between them like a taut wire on the verge of snapping. Officer Daniel Carter's fingers still gripped Olivia Parker's arm, his knuckles white with tension. But there was a flicker of hesitation now, a crack forming in the solid wall of his confidence. The badge in her hand gleamed under the artificial lights, a stark and undeniable reality that clashed violently with the assumptions he had carried into this encounter. His mind scrambled to make sense of it, to force the pieces into a narrative that fit, but nothing aligned in a way that absolved him. The murmurs started softly at first, hushed whispers rippling through the courtroom like an incoming tide. People shifted in their seats, glancing at one another, unsure whether they were witnessing the beginning of a scandal or merely another instance of unchecked authority at play. A few reached for their phones, camera lenses gleaming as they captured the scene unfolding before them. An officer manhandling a black woman in a place where justice was supposed to prevail. The tension thickened, pressing down on the room like a storm cloud about to break. Olivia remained motionless, her expression unreadable, the kind of calm that wasn't passive but deliberate, controlled. It was the kind of restraint that came from years of knowing that one wrong move, one misplaced reaction, could be twisted into justification for worse. She had seen men like Carter before, seen them sneer at people who looked like her, dismiss them, underestimate them. She knew his type better than he knew himself, and as she stared at him, waiting for the weight of his mistake to fully settle, she saw the exact moment he began to realize that he had lost control of the situation. "Let go of me," she said, her voice steady, each word measured and firm. Carter let out a short, incredulous laugh, as if the sheer audacity of her command was almost amusing. The arrogance was still there, clinging to him like a second skin, but there was a new edge to it now, something defensive, something uncertain. "You think just because you flash a badge, I'm supposed to believe you outrank me?" He scoffed, tightening his grip slightly, a final grasp at dominance. "I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, but around here, people like you don't." "Officer Carter." A sharp voice cut through the air like a whip, shattering whatever smug retort he had been about to unleash. A middle-aged man in a tailored gray suit had risen from one of the front rows, his face pale, eyes wide with something close to panic. District Attorney James Holloway, a man who had spent decades navigating the intricacies of power and who, in this moment, looked like he had just witnessed an impending disaster in real time. Carter barely had time to turn before Holloway was storming toward them, his polished shoes clicking against the floor, his expression a mixture of disbelief and urgency. "Let go of her. Now," he ordered, each syllable weighted with authority. Carter hesitated. His grip faltered, his mind warring between instinct and self-preservation. "I said now." Holloway's voice rose, no longer a request but a command, one that carried the kind of consequence Carter had never imagined facing. Slowly, reluctantly, Carter's fingers uncurled, and Olivia stepped back, smoothing the fabric of her suit as if brushing away the remnants of his touch. She did not rub her arm or show any sign of discomfort. She simply stood, her posture unwavering, her presence unshaken. Holloway exhaled sharply and turned to Carter with a glare that could have set the air between them on fire. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" he hissed, his voice low but furious. Carter stiffened, jaw clenched, but the growing unease in his stance was impossible to ignore. "I was handling a situation," he muttered, but even as the words left his mouth, they felt hollow, devoid of the certainty he had clung to just moments ago. "A situation?" Holloway repeated, his tone laced with incredulity. "Do you have the slightest clue who this woman is?" He turned, gesturing toward Olivia with a sharp motion that felt almost reverent, like someone presenting a queen before a court of fools. "This is Chief Olivia Parker, your new superior, the woman who is about to be sworn in as the highest-ranking officer in your entire department." The words hit like a punch to the gut. Carter's breath caught in his throat. The room seemed to tilt for a moment, the ground beneath him shifting as though he had been standing on a foundation he had never realized was unstable. His eyes darted between Holloway and Olivia, searching for some way out, some alternative explanation that could undo the reality he was being forced to confront. A slow, suffocating dread curled in his stomach. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder now, some voices hushed with shock, others edged with something close to satisfaction. The people who had seen what happened, who had recorded it, who had witnessed the arrogance of a man who believed himself untouchable. Now, they watched with the grim realization that he was anything but. The judge, an older woman with sharp eyes and an expression carved from stone, had appeared at the doorway of her chambers, surveying the chaos with an unimpressed gaze. "What the hell is going on in my courtroom?" she demanded. Holloway turned to Olivia, his voice dipping just enough for only those closest to hear. "Chief Parker, do you want to press charges?" Carter's breath hitched. His heart pounded against his ribs, the consequences of his actions closing in like walls tightening around him. Olivia studied him for a long moment, unreadable, calculating. She could have destroyed him with a single word, could have ended his career in a matter of seconds. And the terrifying part was, he knew he had given her every reason to. But when she finally spoke, her voice was measured, controlled. "Not today," she said, her tone laced with something that wasn't quite mercy. "But this conversation isn't over." And just like that, she turned and walked away, leaving Carter standing in the wreckage of his own undoing. The weight of silence in the room was suffocating, a thick, tangible thing pressing against every person present. Olivia Parker stood motionless in the center of it all, her composure unshaken, her gaze locked onto Officer Daniel Carter with the kind of cold, piercing intensity that stripped away every ounce of authority he thought he had. The badge in her hand gleamed under the artificial lights, a small yet undeniable symbol of power that, in an instant, had flipped the entire dynamic of the room upside down. She didn't need to raise her voice, didn't need to command attention. She already had it. Carter, on the other hand, looked like a man who had just realized he was standing at the edge of a cliff with nowhere to go but down. His mouth opened slightly, as if to speak, but no words came out. His fingers twitched at his sides, his usual air of smug confidence evaporating under the weight of the realization crashing down on him. Around him, his fellow officers stood in varying states of disbelief, some shifting awkwardly, some exchanging uncertain glances, others staring at the scene with a dawning sense of grim satisfaction. District Attorney Holloway, still reeling from the sheer absurdity of what had just transpired, let out a slow, measured breath before turning his gaze back to Carter. "Congratulations," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "In less than 5 minutes, you managed to manhandle, threaten, and openly disrespect your new boss. That has to be some kind of record." Carter flinched at the words but quickly masked it with a scowl. He started, but whatever excuse he had been scrambling to put together died before it could even fully form. Olivia took a step forward, and even though she was smaller than him, there was an undeniable weight to her presence that made him instinctively stiffen. "Tell me something, Officer Carter," she said, her voice deceptively calm, almost conversational. "Would you have treated me the same way if I didn't look the way I do?" The question landed like a hammer. Carter's lips pressed into a thin line, his jaw tight, his silence louder than any denial he could have given. Olivia let the moment stretch, giving him just enough time to feel the full gravity of his mistake before continuing. "See, I've dealt with men like you my entire life," she said, her tone never rising, never wavering, but carrying a sharp edge that cut through the air like a blade. "Men who look at someone like me and assume weakness, assume I don't belong, assume they have the right to exert their authority without question." She took another step closer, her eyes never leaving his. "But here's the thing, Officer Carter. You don't intimidate me. You never could. And after today, I suspect you won't be intimidating anyone for much longer." A ripple of murmurs moved through the crowd of onlookers, officers shifting uncomfortably, some outright averting their eyes. There was no saving Carter from this, no way to brush it under the rug or spin it in his favor. The truth of what had happened was out in the open, exposed for all to see. The judge, who had been watching with an expression that could have frozen a man solid, finally spoke up. "Chief Parker," she said, emphasizing the title in a way that sent another wave of discomfort through Carter. "I assume you'll be handling this situation accordingly?" Olivia inclined her head slightly. "I will," she replied, her tone leaving no room for doubt. Carter inhaled sharply, his shoulders tensing as he took a half-step back, but there was nowhere to retreat. He had built his entire career on the foundation of unchecked power, on the belief that the badge he wore shielded him from consequences. But now, as he stood before a woman he had underestimated in the worst possible way, the cracks in that foundation were beginning to show. Holloway crossed his arms, looking at Carter with something bordering on amusement. "You know," he mused, "I'd say you should probably start packing up your desk, but something tells me Chief Parker has bigger plans for you." Carter's pulse hammered in his ears. His instinct screamed at him to fight back, to argue, to deflect. But there was nothing he could say, no defense that wouldn't sound like a pathetic attempt at salvaging the unsalvageable. He swallowed hard, his throat dry, his world tilting dangerously off balance. Olivia let the silence linger, let him stew in the consequences of his actions, before finally turning to the assembled officers in the room. Her expression was unreadable, but her voice carried the unmistakable weight of finality. "This department will no longer be a place where abuse of power goes unchecked," she said. "If anyone has a problem with that, they are welcome to hand in their badge now." No one moved. No one spoke. Carter, for the first time in his life, felt something he wasn't used to. Powerless. The weight of what had transpired in that courtroom had not dissipated in the days that followed. If anything, it had only grown, spreading like wildfire through the town, through the media, through every whispered conversation in the hallways of the police department. Officer Daniel Carter had been suspended within 24 hours, pending an internal investigation that everyone already knew would be little more than a formality. The damning footage had gone viral, security cameras, cell phone recordings, every angle imaginable capturing the moment he had manhandled the very woman who now held his future in the palm of her hand. It played on news stations across the country, dissected and replayed with scathing commentary, reducing him to a symbol of everything broken within the system. And while Carter had spent his entire career basking in the illusion of untouchability, there was no escaping this. At first, he had tried to fight it, frantically calling in favors, reaching out to the few allies he had left, attempting to twist the narrative into something that might lessen the damage. He told himself that if he could just explain, just make people understand that he hadn't known who she was, that it had been a mistake, that he wasn't the monster they were making him out to be, then maybe, just maybe, he could salvage what little remained of his dignity. But deep down, he knew the truth. It wasn't just that he hadn't known. It was that he hadn't cared. And now he was paying the price. 3 days after the incident, Olivia Parker walked through the doors of the precinct for the first time as chief of police. She moved with the same quiet, effortless authority that had left Carter reeling in the courtroom, her expression unreadable, her presence demanding attention without needing to ask for it. The department had been called into a mandatory meeting, and as she stepped into the conference room, the tension was suffocating. Officers stood at attention, back stiff, expressions guarded. Some stole glances at Carter, who sat in the farthest chair, shoulders hunched, hands clasped tightly in his lap. He looked nothing like the man he had been just days ago. Olivia let her gaze sweep across the room, taking in every detail, every shift in posture, every flicker of unease. Then, with measured purpose, she spoke. "I know what some of you are thinking," she began, her voice steady, deliberate. "You're wondering if things are going to change. You're wondering if I'm here to tear this place apart, to root out every last officer who has ever made a mistake, to burn everything to the ground just to prove a point." She let the words settle, let the weight of them press against the room before continuing. "But that's not why I'm here. I'm here because I believe in what this department can be. I believe in justice, in integrity, in the kind of leadership that serves and protects without bias, without prejudice, without fear. A murmur rippled through the crowd, uncertain but listening. She took a step forward. "What I will not tolerate," she said, her voice sharpening ever so slightly, "is abuse of power. I will not tolerate officers who think their badge grants them the right to intimidate, to discriminate, to degrade the very people they swore to protect. And I will not tolerate the silence of those who stand by and let it happen." She didn't need to say Carter's name. She didn't need to look at him. Everyone already knew. For the first time since she had entered the room, he lifted his head, his face drawn, his pride in ruins. He had spent years looking at people like Olivia Parker as though they were beneath him, had convinced himself that his authority was something innate, something earned by nothing more than the uniform he wore. But now, as he sat under her scrutiny, under the collective judgment of the people who had once followed his lead, he felt small. Olivia let the silence stretch just long enough to make her point before continuing. "If anyone in this room has a problem with what I stand for, if anyone believes they cannot serve under my leadership with honor and respect, you are free to leave. Right now." She gestured toward the door. No questions asked. No one moved. She nodded once, satisfied, before straightening her shoulders. "Then let's get to work." And just like that, the meeting was over. Officers exchanged glances, some murmuring to one another, others walking stiffly back to their desks, the tension shifting from anticipation to something else entirely, something closer to acceptance. Carter remained seated long after the room had emptied, staring down at his hands, the weight of his downfall pressing heavy on his chest. He had always believed that power was something he could hold on to, something that belonged to him by default. But today, in the silence of his own disgrace, he finally understood the truth. It had never belonged to him at all.